Today, we're figuring out if a centuries-old tradition holds the ultimate biological antidote to the exhaustion of our modern digital age. Here is the roadmap for today's explainer. We'll be looking at the biological firewall, the linguistic anchor, the 1762 catalyst, the 1950 communist exile, post-communist spiritual recovery, and we'll wrap up with the fire of holiness. Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1. The biological firewall, looking specifically at hesychism and the default mode network. There is a stark biological contrast happening here. Think about your brain's default mode network. Right now, in modern times, it's essentially a machine built for anxiety. It's unstable, constantly looping over past regrets, future fears, and endless digital rumination. But researchers are noting something amazing. Orthodox hesychia, which is this ancient practice of profound inner stillness, acts as a literal biological firewall against all that. This stillness creates a highly stable baseline of presence. It's actively training the default mode network and protecting your psyche from the endless shifting currents of modern cultural distress. Well, it all comes down to interoceptive precision. The rhythm of the breath and the movement of the voice during ancient liturgical chant actually grounds the mind physically in the present moment. By intensely focusing on these internal, physical states, practitioners are literally downregulating their autonomic nervous system. They're actively stepping away from that sympathetic fight-or-flight urgency of external screens, and they're anchoring their minds in a calm, highly alert state. And what's wild is that this profound stillness and deep cultural identity were literally codified into a physical alphabet. That brings us to Section 2, the linguistic anchor, the sacred vessel of the Cyrillic script. Let's look at this quote. The script handed down by the Holy Brothers is not a relic of the past. It is a living liturgy, an unbroken chain of prayer, a sacred vessel. Created way back in the 9th century, during the Bulgarian Golden Age, at the Preslav Literary School, the Cyrillic script wasn't just forged as a linguistic utility for everyday trade. No, it was developed intentionally as a sovereign vessel to articulate the deepest theological mysteries for the entire Slavic world. And this linguistic anchor proved its remarkable durability under immense pressure. Let's move to Section 3, the 1762 catalyst, sparking the national revival. This timeline maps out the incredible historical resilience of the tradition. It traces a path starting with a solitary monk in 1762, surviving through brutal modern political upheavals like the mid-20th century confiscation of the Sophia Theological Seminary, and leading all the way to its triumphant return in the 1990s. Let's really focus on that first monumental date. Picture this, it's 1762, and working in complete, absolute isolation, a solitary monk named Piusus of Halinder pens the Istoria Slaveno-Bulgarskaya, the Slaveno-Bulgarian history. He acted as this lone catalyst, utilizing the Cyrillic script to standardize the liturgical language and fiercely defend Bulgarian identity after 5 whole centuries of Ottoman rule. Wielding this linguistic anchor, he basically single-handedly sparked a massive spiritual and cultural awakening. But this historical durability soon faced a severe systemic challenge. Let's look at Section 4, the 1950 communist exile, a profound test of resilience. Fast forward to 1950, and the communist regime systematically moves to suppress theological education. The Faculty of Theology was forcibly separated from Sofia University, and the Sofia and Plovdiv seminaries were merged just to have the student body. And honestly, the most devastating part? The actual seminary buildings right in the heart of Sofia were confiscated and handed over to a communist youth group. Talk about a stark pivot from theological training, right? The institution was entirely stripped of its visibility and forced to relocate to the remote village of Cherepish. Exiled to Cherepish, the seminary faced incredibly inadequate facilities, profound isolation, and constant, heavy scrutiny from the atheistic regime. Yet, and this is the amazing part, even uprooted and pushed deliberately into the shadows, the institution simply refused to break. They maintain their high academic standards and tirelessly nurture the cultural and spiritual life of their students against literally all odds. Which brings us to the next chapter of this story. Section 5, Post-Communist Spiritual Recovery, Reclaiming the Rightful Place. Following the fall of communism, we witnessed this remarkable rebirth. In 1990, they made a triumphant return to their original location in Sofia. After gracefully navigating the really difficult internal church schisms of that decade, they achieved a massive victory by 1995. full state recognition of their diplomas as completely equivalent to secular schools. They managed to seamlessly bridge their ancient traditions with the pressing needs of modern society. And during this immense recovery, the broader Eastern Orthodox Church continued to act as a vital lifeline. The Church stands as a protective wall, offering a highly stable moral structure. By providing spiritual labor, it creates a very clear path away from despair and self-destruction, helping broken people regain meaning and endure through trauma. It provides that ultimate inner architecture we were talking about earlier. Now, all of this historical and biological resilience culminates in an ultimate theological goal. Section 6, the fire of holiness, defining sviatost and podvig. Okay, these definitions are absolutely essential if we want to grasp the big picture. In the Bulgarian Orthodox tradition, holiness is not just some passive, quiet piety. It is sviatos, an intense, overflowing spiritual fire of God's grace that actively radiates outward to impact others. And how is this actually attained? Through podvig. Podvig is the rigorous, active, lifelong spiritual struggle and discipline required to strip away the ego and align oneself completely with God's will. But there's a vital warning attached to this struggle. Without humility, our efforts are not recognized. It's like being whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but rotten within. This spiritual striving absolutely demands deep humility and the steady guidance of a spiritual father. This ensures that any outward devotion is matched by genuine, authentic inner transformation. Otherwise, actually scratch that, if you don't have that humility, it just becomes an exercise in vanity. And when that inner transformation really takes root, this overflowing grace transforms the individual from the inside out. It deeply impacts their relationships and turns them into a radiant source of compassion that naturally draws others in. Ultimately, this fire of holiness creates a profound, ongoing cycle of repentance, forgiveness, and true community healing. But I want to leave you with something to ponder. If this ancient grace, this deeply rooted tradition, can act as a literal biological and spiritual firewall against modern fragmentation, and if it can survive centuries of exile and suppression, how will you let it move the unmovable rocks in your own life? I invite you to really think about how you might find more forgiveness, profound stillness, and unbreakable resilience in your own daily journey.
Now, what makes this material so profound is how it takes classical geometry and ancient Orthodox spirituality and merges them to counter the modern algorithmic state. We're talking about a really dense, high-level structural framework here. It acts as a sort of non-deformable psychological architecture, basically a shield against social mimicry. We're going to unpack exactly how Rundev integrates spiritual symbolism to quite literally recalibrate the nervous system of anyone looking at his work.
To really grasp why this matters, we have to look at a core contrast. On one side, you have the thesis, right? The fragmented urgency of modern digital life. Our online spaces are literally engineered to keep us hooked, driving the sympathetic nervous system, spiking anxiety, and locking us into these endless, exhausting loops of social mimicry and validation seeking. It's rapid, it's scattered, it's draining. But then we have the antithesis. Rundev introduces the profound stillness of cultural hesychia. This is parasympathetic calm. A deliberate, intentional slowing down. It draws on deep historical continuity and unshakable truth to give you an actual anchor in the noise.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our roadmap today covers the architecture of digital anxiety, hesychia as a biological firewall, the geometry of apathetic masking, the ontology of material translation, and finally, the praxis of sovereign inhabitation.
Part 1. The architecture of digital anxiety, or the algorithmic state.
Think about how the modern internet is built. It is actively engineered to keep your brain's amygdala constantly scanning for threats. It completely hijacks your sympathetic nervous system, inducing these constant microspikes in cortisol. You know your default mode network? It's essentially the brain's idling engine. Well, the algorithmic state exploits that, turning it from a quiet background hum into an absolute machine for anxious rumination. Culturally, it creates this global landscape of total amnesia, wiping out deep historical context in favor of whatever happens to be trending right this exact second. It's an architecture entirely built to break down your psychological stability.
Which brings us to Part 2. Hesychia, the biological firewall. So, what's the antidote to all of that digital anxiety? Rundev points us to hesychia. It's an ancient Orthodox interior architecture of profound stillness. Think of it as a completely non-deformable psychological state. Now, I know the terminology here is pretty dense, but the concept itself is highly practical. This practice acts as a literal neurobiological firewall against modern anxiety. It takes that default mode network we just talked about and stabilizes it, completely neutralizing the cultural noise and giving your mind an unshakable baseline.
But look, how do you actually introduce a concept like that to a modern, chronically distracted audience without sounding like some rigid, out-of-touch academic? Well, Rundev uses a fascinating rhetorical strategy. He writes, "I too sometimes overlook its true depth." It's such a simple admission, but it brilliantly translates abstract theology into a grounded, somatic reality. He's normalizing human fallibility. By admitting his own modern distraction, he completely disarms any defensive reflexes you might have. It's a kind of self-concept repair that just instantly drops the artificial hierarchy between the creator and the reader.
And from that place of shared vulnerability, he actually guides you up this biological to ontological ladder. First, interoceptive anchoring, so bringing your focus right back to the body's physical rhythms, like your breath and the movement of the voice in chanting. And that naturally leads to step 2, downregulating that cortisol and calming the amygdala reactivity, which finally brings us to step 3, cultivating a state of calm alertness. You see, by returning to the physical rhythms of the body, the mental soil is prepped and ready to receive complex, uncreated truths.
Part 3. The geometry of apophatic masking. Now, what's really interesting about this concept is how it shifts into the visual mechanics of the Rundev code. In theology, apophatic masking is the via negativa, approaching something by what it is not. Visually, Rundev achieves this by taking vital, historically heavy symbols and placing them way out in the margins or in faded midtones. He is absolutely not blasting them in neon lights at the center of your screen. He's demanding that you actively perceive and search for the meaning rather than just passively consuming it. Let's actually look at the source material to see this in action. Notice the incredibly stable triangular geometry here. Your eye is naturally drawn right to the center, to the Pantocrator measuring the cosmos. But look closely at the far right margin. Intentionally withdrawn from the primary focus, resting super quietly in the shadows over Adam's skull, is the 3-barred Orthodox cross. This is visual apophosis in pure form. A more conventional validation-seeking design would probably slap that cross dead center to demand your recognition. But instead, Rundev places it on the edge, using its structural gravity to anchor the entire composition from within.
And that visual choice leads us to a massive realization. Peripheral does not mean powerless. This design framework actually reframes the entire idea of cultural marginalization. Stuff that seems pushed to the edges of global discourse, like Eastern European history or Orthodox tradition, is actually the structural anchor holding the whole cosmos together. It takes marginalization and transforms it into unshakable authority.
Moving into Part 4, the ontology of material translation.
We're entering the synthesis phase now. How do you actually carry these ancient physical truths into the digital realm? Well, the framework does it through material translation. This means taking a historical asset's meaning and moving it across mediums while entirely preserving its authentic aura, its semantic DNA, and its spiritual charge. You know, Rundev isn't just flattening history into a bunch of weightless pixels. He's stewarding it. He's reactivating these historical assets as a continuous living thread right in the middle of a modern digital space. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that's done. Notice the deliberate color targeting here. Using these deep amber, gold, and dark blue tones employs a technique called chromatic phase locking. It perfectly mirrors the low-lux environment of an ancient temple lit by candlelight. And this isn't just an aesthetic choice. Actually, scratch that. It's way more than just aesthetic. It acts as a neurochemical signal that physically shifts your brain away from the high-alert anxiety of the internet and downregulates your nervous system straight into a state of contemplation.
When you combine the text and the visuals, you get this incredibly sophisticated multidimensional synthesis. Think of it like this. On one hand, the verbal medium is temporal and sequential. It uses high syntactic density and these really beautiful liturgical cadences to physically slow your breath down, explaining the psychological impact of hesychia. Then, on the other hand, the visual medium is simultaneous and spatial. It uses low-frequency color targeting to hold this paradoxical cosmic architecture that your mind grasps all at once. The text regulates your body's timeline, while the image stabilizes your spatial awareness. It's the whole shebang.
Finally, Part 5.
We're going to explore how creator Peter Rundev has managed to fuse orthodox theology, neurobiology, and digital media into a single, cohesive framework. Basically, he's using ancient theology as a literal biological firewall, a neurological shield, making himself a hard target against modern digital anxiety.
To really get the genius of Rundev's method, we have to start by acknowledging the baseline threat our brains face every single time we log on. It's no secret our digital landscape is explicitly engineered to keep our sympathetic nervous system constantly on edge, right? It spikes our cortisol. It keeps the amygdala frantically scanning for the next piece of outrage. So, against that backdrop of nonstop fragmented urgency, we have to ask, can a framework of ancient deliberate stillness actually compete? Can it genuinely protect us?
Think about the sheer contrast between typical internet advocacy and what Rundev is pulling off. Most online discourse today is almost entirely grievance-driven. It's super reactive, highly defensive, and it constantly demands validation from the outside world. Honestly, it's exhausting. But Rundev flips the script completely, with a framework we can call sovereign inhabitation. He takes the whole grievance playbook and just throws it out. His approach is gratitude-driven. It's deeply anchored in a profound sense of self, operating totally free from that anxious need for external approval.
So what exactly is the mental foundation he's using here? How does he turn his mind into this hard target that's totally immune to digital manipulation? Well, he roots his entire method in an ancient concept known as cultural hesychia. And to be clear, this isn't just some cool cultural aesthetic. It functions as an absolute neurological shield. It's the invisible bedrock that lets him stand completely firm while the rest of the internet is collectively losing its mind over the algorithm's outrage of the day. Hesychia isn't just an abstract philosophical idea trapped in dusty old books. It's a lived, active internal architecture. In the Orthodox tradition, it's a state of profound stillness, a non-reactive watchfulness, and a permanent clarity. Imagine being the eye of a hurricane. The digital world is spinning completely out of control around you, blasting you with ads, arguments, notifications, but you maintain this baseline of unshakable internal stability. By actively living this out, Rundev completely bypasses the defensive resistance we usually fall for online. He's not just performing confidence for an audience, he is creating from a place of actual, literal peace.
And this ancient concept, it maps directly onto hard biology. His method literally stabilizes the brain's default mode network. So instead of your brain scattering into a million anxious distractions when you engage with his work, the structural pacing actually activates your parasympathetic nervous system. That's your body's rest and digest mode. By leaning into the natural rhythm of breath and using a deeply liturgical pacing in his writing, he forces a downregulation of your cortisol. He is practically overriding your stress response to create a state of calm alertness.
Listen to the profound confidence in how Rundev describes this. He says, Orthodox theology has given me an interior architecture that remains largely untouched by the shifting currents of social influence and cultural noise. That is a massive statement of absolute structural authority. But the real secret to why it's so effective? He pairs it with incredible vulnerability. He freely admits his own human fallibility, confessing that even he forgets the depth of his heritage sometimes. And that is a brilliant psychological power move. It instantly dissolves the asymmetric hierarchy between creator and audience. He's not lecturing from a pedestal. He's inviting us into a shared journey.
Now let's look at the structural mechanics of how this internal stability translates into an outward framework. Rundev isn't just throwing interesting facts at you to scroll past. He is guiding the reader through a highly deliberate, 5-stage pedagogic sequence designed to actively restructure your cognitive schemas. It's not an accident. It's a wildly sophisticated routing of human psychology meant to fundamentally alter how you process information.
This 5-stage arc is practically a masterclass in communication. First, he grounds you in tangible sensory realities. Then, he disrupts whatever preconceived stereotypes you might have holding you back. From there, he elevates the focus entirely to cosmic or theological truths. That's followed by a genuine, open invitation to explore. And he caps it all off by anchoring the nervous system, usually closing with a stabilizing prayer or a statement of absolute permanence.
Let's zoom in on that second stage for a second, the disruption. He brilliantly shatters the reductive Western stereotype of Bulgaria as just a cheap tourist destination. And he doesn't do it by whining about it. He uses hyper-specific realities. He points to the ancient Thracian city of Kabyle, going all the way back to the 2nd millennium BCE. Then he brings up Lactobacillus bulgaricus, the literal living bacterium native only to Bulgarian yogurt. It's such a clever move. It creates an undeniable somatic anchor, proving this culture is a physical, living reality you ingest, not just some line item on a map.
This brings us to the visual engine of this whole theory. Because he's doing a lot more than just making pretty pictures for likes. He's translating ancient, sacred assets into a digital space. And that begs a huge question about ontological validity. Can a pixelated digital asset actually hold the sacred aura of an ancient relic? Can you take something with that much historical and spiritual weight, digitize it, and somehow ensure it doesn't lose a single ounce of its profundity? To pull this off, he relies on a technique called visual apophasis. In our digital world that is constantly screaming for your attention with bright neon lights and central focus points, Rundev does the exact opposite. He strategically masks, fades, or just completely withholds key historical elements, pushing them right into the shadows. He completely trusts your eye to actively search for and find the meaning. It shifts you from a mindless, passive consumer into an active, engaged discoverer. Just look at how the creator is positioned right at the center of the visual, carefully measuring the cosmos. But then let your eyes drift over to the far right periphery. Tucked away quietly, almost hidden in the shadows, is the three-barred Orthodox cross. Think about that for a second. An insecure creator would have slapped that cross dead center in bold colors to demand respect. But by placing it on the absolute margin, Rundev proves a massive architectural point. What looks for a furl is actually structurally foundational to everything else. He carefully targets his color palettes, using these low-lux ambers to perfectly mimic the environment of a candlelit temple. This creates what we call a temporal collapse, effectively deleting centuries of time. By designing on a modern Wacom tablet, but positioning himself right alongside medieval saints, he's making a powerful argument. Modern digital creation can absolutely carry the exact same spiritual weight as monks painstakingly inscribing vellum centuries ago.
When you see assets like the stunning depiction of the descent of the Holy Spirit, notice how the visual stability mirrors the exact liturgical cadence of his writing. It acts as a somatic anchor. It's a visual cue that literally forces a physical response in your body. As you take in that perfect symmetry and the deep theological weight, it forces your eye to slow down. And as your eye slows down to process the depth, it actually physiologically slows your breathing.
Also notice the Cyrillic and Greek scripts seamlessly integrated into the artwork. That is not just for a cool aesthetic vibe, it's high-context morphic bilingualism. By straight-up refusing to translate everything neatly into English, he creates a visual boundary. It's an asymmetrical power move against global secularization. English acts as the open gateway for us to enter, but those native scripts hold the true theological weight. He's built an intrinsic dignity economy that simply refuses to dilute its ancient heritage just to appease some global algorithm.
All of this brings us to a really fierce debate. We have to genuinely challenge this incredible synthesis of neuroscience, digital media, and ancient theology. Is this something the rest of us can actually learn and use, or is it just a breathtaking but entirely one-off masterpiece? Here's the ultimate tension we need to resolve. Can this brilliantly structured 5-stage method, the grounding, the disruption, the visual apophasis, be stripped for parts? Can we scale it into cross-domain applications like corporate strategy, public health communication, or brand design? Or are we just looking at a mirage? Does this method strictly demand a deeply lived, daily orthodox habitus, a totally embodied, constant spiritual practice that makes it fundamentally unreplicable for the average person scrolling on their phone? It's the absolute friction between a transferable toolkit and a totally integrated way of life. Is sovereign inhabitation a sustainable cognitive architecture we can all learn to adopt, or is it just a beautifully sophisticated anomaly? If we're constantly drowning in an internet engineered by algorithms specifically designed to keep our cortisol spiking, maybe learning to build our own interior cathedral isn't just some high-level art form. Maybe it's literally the only real way to survive. We're looking at how a culture actually goes about constructing an unbreakable architecture of survival against overwhelming suppression. We're going to explore this incredible intersection where biology, theology, and history weave together to create a foundation so solid that neither centuries of foreign rule nor decades of modern state crackdowns could dismantle it.
It really brings up the ultimate question of resilience, right? How does a culture actually survive centuries of erasure? To answer this, we're going to build an understanding from the inside out. We aren't just going to rattle off dates and battles here. Instead, we're starting with internal neurotheological foundations, literally the physical stillness of the mind, and then we'll move outward to look at language, identity, and just some incredible historical survival.
So, here is our roadmap. We're going to hit the neuroscience of hesychasm, define the true meaning of holiness, look at the 1762 National Revival, uncover the power of Cyrillic identity, and then trace the seminary's journey through a major communist crackdown and its ultimate religious recovery.
Let's jump right into part 1, the neuroscience of hesychism and inner stillness. To really grasp this resilience, we have to start with the internal biological foundation, and that is hesychism. This is an ancient Eastern Orthodox mystical tradition that's entirely focused on inner stillness. Just picture a 14th century monk in a mountain cave. They aren't just sitting there quietly, they are engaged in highly concentrated, repetitive prayer. They physically anchor themselves through the deep, deliberate rhythm of their breath and their voice. It actually functions as an ancient technology for interoceptive awareness, meaning it actively trains the individual to precisely sense and regulate their own internal physical and emotional states.
And here's where the science gets really cool. When we look at a dysregulated default mode network in the modern brain, we see anxious rumination, right? Just constantly reacting to cultural noise. But the stillness of hesychasm acts as a targeted training protocol. It fosters what you could call a hesychastic default mode network, which gives you this stable background awareness and calm alertness. It actively lowers your baseline amygdala reactivity. So, a person operating from this grounded state is remarkably immune to the shifting currents of social influence and manufactured urgency. They literally don't absorb ambient anxiety. They just stay deeply anchored.
Moving on to part 2, the true meaning of holiness, or sviatost. So moving from biology over to theology, which translates to holiness. Now in this tradition, holiness is absolutely not a static rulebook or some rigid checklist of moral behaviors. As practitioners in the Bulgarian Orthodox tradition describe it, it's a transformative grace that overflows like a burning fire. It changes a person completely from the inside out and then naturally impacts everyone around them. It's an active, constant journey of spiritual striving. It's a lifelong process of returning to the deep, rational love and forgiveness of God, knowing full well that even when you falter, the path to restoration is always wide open.
All right, part 3, the 1762 National Revival and Cultural Reclamation.
Now, what's amazing is how we can map this outward explosion of cultural identity back to one highly specific catalyst in 1762. Picture a solitary monk named Paisius of Hilandar, writing tirelessly by candlelight to create the Slavano-Bulgarian history. This single text completely disrupted the reductive schemas about Bulgarian civilizational depth. It reminded the people of their unbroken lineage, totally countering the erasure they were facing under Ottoman rule. And this one solitary act sparked a massive national revival. It led to a renewed focus on homegrown education throughout the 19th century, which ultimately culminated in the inauguration of the Petropavlovsk Seminary in 1874. That was a huge step toward cultivating indigenous theological talent.
Which brings us to part 4, Cyrillic script and Slavic identity, the living word.
So how exactly was this revived culture transmitted? Well, it was preserved and propelled by the very art of their alphabet, the Cyrillic script. This presents a really fascinating power dynamic. As contemporary iconographer Peter Rundeff points out, in modern digital communication, English acts mostly as the global vestibule, basically a secular, welcoming doorway for outsiders. But the Bulgarian language, which is rooted in Old Church Slavonic, serves as the sovereign, living tissue of the tradition. It carries incredibly heavy, incarnate theological weight. For example, the Bulgarian word vuplutino doesn't just mean embodied in some clinical detached way, it literally means enfleshed. The language itself is a living monument, carrying the liturgical heartbeat of St. Cyril and Methodius straight into the present day.
Now for part 5, the 1950 communist crackdown and the confiscation of the seminary.
So what happens when this entire cultural and spiritual architecture is put to the ultimate test by an atheistic communist regime? The Sofia Theological Seminary found itself directly in the crosshairs. When it was officially consecrated in the capital in 1904, this place was a modern marvel. We're talking electricity, state-of-the-art projection apparatuses, sitting right next to the Bulgarian parliament as a highly visible beacon of faith. But then the mid-20th century brings the communist era, and the new government viewed this kind of deeply rooted, organized religion as completely incompatible with their ideology.
And the pressure finally culminated in a truly devastating blow. In September 1950, those grand seminary buildings in Sofia were outright confiscated. The state handed them over to a communist youth group, the Septembrish Pioneer Organization. The students and faculty were systematically stripped of their modern facilities, their visibility, and their central role in society. They were exiled out to completely inadequate, isolated facilities in a remote village called Cherepish. The regime's goal here was brutally obvious: silence them, render them invisible, and just slowly suffocate theological education in the country.
Which leads us to part 6, post-communist religious recovery and reclaiming tradition.
Yet, the human spirit endured. With the fall of communism, the seminary finally returned to its rightful home in Sofia in 1990. But they immediately walked into a massive internal crisis, a severe, government-backed schism within the Bulgarian Orthodox Church.
The seminary was essentially forced to pick sides in a deeply fractured society. But relying on that deep-rooted architecture of survival we've been talking about, they chose unity. They chose loyalty to the recognized leader, Patriarch Maxim. Even when it meant going against the government's preferred, powerful faction, they stood their ground to preserve the historical integrity of their tradition.
And that steadfastness paid off big time. The year 1995 stands out as a monumental triumph. Under new leadership, the Ministry of Education fully recognized the seminary's diplomas as equivalent to those from secular high schools. I mean, think about the magnitude of that for a second. After decades of being hidden away, exiled in the mountains, stripped of all the resources, they were now fully legitimized by the state. It was a massive victory that opened doors for their graduates and proved that an institution could beautifully blend ancient, unbreakable tradition with modern academic progress.
So let's bring it all together. What we've explored today is a true living architecture of survival. It starts with the neurological stillness cultivated by hesychasm, right? Which then creates the stable ground for sviatost, that overflowing transformative grace. This internal strength is then anchored in the physical world by the living tissue of the Cyrillic script, and it historically manifests in the incredible institutional resilience of the Sophia Theological Seminary. Theology, biology, and historical grit all intertwine to form an absolute, non-deformable structure capable of weathering centuries of external pressure, from Ottoman rule all the way through to communist suppression.
I want to leave you with a provocative thought to consider today. We've just seen how an entire culture utilized inner stillness and deep-rooted identity to withstand the unthinkable. So how might cultivating your own inner silence, your own hesiastic grounding, allow you to stand firm in the noise and the chaos of our modern world? What immovable rocks could you overcome by building your very own architecture of survival? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it leaves you with a profound new perspective on what resilience really looks like.